Hello there and welcome back. This is Jamie again. During our first video we talked about four things, or the key four elements that we calculate all of our usage information from, and we kind of went over in a high level. We talked about how these four things interact and how we calculate the number missing from them, and we looked about how the software presents that information on the analysis tab. But I wanted just to go back over this again because it's so important, and kind of go over a theoretical angle, which is basically comparing. I kind of mixed between during the first video. There's actually, as we said, the main thing we're trying to determine here is how many items are missing, and there's actually, I blended or mixed up two different methods I was using to determine how many was missing, and so I just wanted to explicitly draw that comparison between those two different methods because both of them are useful and important in terms of the work we do. So here we go. So as we discussed in the first one, the critical piece of information we want to know, and basically the information we calculate and basically sell this information in our reports, is we need to know how many servings are missing. And so in order to do this, we used the example of using bottles of Budweiser. And I apologize, I did change the numbers here to hopefully make it easier. Just the numbers weren't repeated. I don't know if I've succeeded there, but either way, we're using some new numbers here. So let's just check back on what those four pieces of information are. And as a reminder, these four pieces of information, if you know these four pieces of information about any product, you can calculate how many is missing, and basically that's what we do for a living. So the previous count, pretty simple, is just what was present during the last count. So in this example, we're going to say that when we did the count last week, we found 100 bottles of Budweiser beer. And then the invoiced amount is how many were delivered during the audit period. And in this case, we've actually changed that number, and that's going to be 50. So we're working off, said, previous count of 100, 50 delivered during the cycle. Then the current count is whatever you found during your count that you're doing today. In this case, we're saying that the count is 70, 70. And then the fourth piece of information is how many were sold. That's information, obviously, we typically pull from the point of sale system. And in this case, we're saying that 75 bottles of Budweiser were sold during the period. So in both cases, there's two different methods that we're going to use to calculate a number of missing. And basically from these four values, we're able to calculate two sort of intermediate or calculated values. It gets a little complicated, but let me explain here. So you can, from those four things, you can calculate how many were used or poured as follows. What you do is, in the most simple instance, the number poured would be, if we started with 100 and then we ended up with 25, then obviously we would have used 75. But in this case, we've got the additional complication, that we had some delivered during the period. So if we started with a previous count of 100 and our current count today is 70, then that would say that start with 100, finish up with 70, you've used 30. But in this case, we had 50 delivered, so we need to add in those, 100 minus 70 would be 30, plus 50 is obviously 80. So that's what we get. So using, as said, those, in this case, we're using three of our four things here. We're using the previous count, the current count, and the invoiced amount to determine how many was used or poured. So that used or poured is a calculated value that we derive from these three different sort of starting numbers. And then the other calculated value that we use to do the second method is to calculate how many we should have on hand. What's the expected count? And then the method here, of course, is you determine how many should we have found, how many did we actually find, and determine how many are missing. So in that case, the expected count is, again, pretty simple. In the most simple instance, if we started with 100 and we sold 75, we'd be expecting to find 75. I'm sorry. If we started with 100 and we sold 75, we'd be expecting to find 25. But again, the number invoiced here is a complication. So in this case, if we started with 100, we sold 75, but we had 50 delivered, then this calculation is 100 plus 50 is 150, minus 75 is 75. So our expected count we've calculated at 75. And then let's think about how we use these four initial things and the calculated values during these two different methods. So the two different methods to determine the number missing. The most intuitive one, the one that you're going to probably, when you're talking with your clients and explaining, what's going on, the most intuitive one is to say, hey guys, you guys rung up 75, but you poured 80. So the simplest way I think to think about this is to compare how many were sold, how many were poured during the period. In this instance, the number missing is calculated as the number poured minus the number sold. So from this instance, we calculated up here that the number poured was 80, and we know from the point of sale, it's one of the original numbers, that the number sold was 75. So in that case, we're missing 5. So as I said, that's the simplest way I think to do it. Compare, hey, we poured 80, we sold 75, obviously we're missing 5, and obviously the number poured is one of these calculated values. Then the second method, which I think is a little bit less intuitive, but in practice it's what we do when we're using the software, and it's more useful when you're actually doing these calculations and trying to find errors, etc., is to compare how many we should have had, the expected count, versus how many we did actually have, or the current count. So this works as follows. So in this case, the number missing is simply the expected count minus the current count. So in this case, we calculate our expected count as 75 up here, and the current count was 70. So we just take the difference between those and come to that same answer. So obviously the 5 here is the same 5 here. Again, two different methods to come to the same conclusion. And just to break this out again, to sort of link it back to the 4 things, you saw here, I'm actually only calculating it based on 2 numbers. But you see the expected count, of course, was based off these 3 things, plus this current count. So those are basically how my 4 things combine to tell us how many we're missing. So let's just quickly have a discussion about, obviously these 2 methods are producing the exact same answer, which is, hey guys, we're missing 4 bottles of Budweiser beer. But when and where do we use both of these options? Well, as I said, rung versus poured I think is more intuitive. When you're explaining this to a client, if you say, hey guys, you sold 75 bottles of Budweiser, but we're missing, or we poured 80 during the period, meaning we're missing 5, that's the most simplest, easy to understand conversation to have with a client. And when you're having this conversation, typically you're going to be talking in units. So in the case of bottled beer is a strange one actually, because we don't differentiate between units and servings, because we count in full bottles. We don't count cases. If we see a full case, we count 24. So we're always working in bottle counts in the bottled beer category. So not so relevant. But if we were talking about, said, rung versus poured in the draft category, we'd talk about, hey, for Coors Light this period, we sold 100, we rung 100 servings of Coors Light, and we poured 120, say, and said that the servings would be the typical units to present this in. Then the second method, where we're comparing the expected versus actual counts, that's typically what we use kind of in the process of producing these numbers. It's ultimately how the software calculates this, and I think it's more useful for you guys when you're learning how to do this to think about the expected versus the actual count, because it forces you to look at all 4 of those elements. So again here, basically we're using this calculation, we're saying that the expected count is how many we started with, plus how many were delivered, minus how many were sold. Again, that makes pretty good sense. We start with 100, then we get 50 more delivered at the beginning of the week, meaning we've got 100, and then we sell 75. So we had 150, we sold 75. We should have had 75, but we actually had 70, so we're missing 5. So the reason I like comparing expected versus actual counts is it's an easier way to think about all of these 4 pieces together. And obviously, if there's an error in here, it has to be an error in one of these 4 values. That's the only possibility. So if you systematically go through and check these 4 items, then you can be sure that your number is correct or find the error. So it's useful because, I said, it forces you to consider the 4 different elements. And then we talked about it typically being servings when we do rung versus poured. When we're comparing expected versus actual counts, typically we're going to be dealing in units, because of course we count in full units. So in the case of keg beer, we might be saying, hey, we're expecting to find 4.3 kegs of Coors Light, but actually we found 4 kegs, meaning we're missing 0.3 of a keg. Again, of course, we could tie that missing 0.3 of a keg back to servings, but ultimately, again, same information presented in different units and calculated from the same way. I know that this is confusing. I'm going sort of through and round in circles how I'm discussing this, but this is really worthwhile you going through a couple of times, thinking it through, maybe watch this video a couple of times, but you ultimately really need to get comfortable with what these calculations are. And like most things, it seems confusing at the start. Eventually the penny will drop and this will become very intuitive, and having a good grasp of this will help you, I think, understand and explain things to your clients. So definitely something worthwhile to do. So there we have it. I think next videos we're going to get into the training manual and running through the different topics in there. So this is it for our sort of high level introduction in terms of how we determine the results that ultimately we sell to our clients.